I still remember every detail of the day our world fell. The war against the humans was the longest and most devastating we had ever faced. In the end, our mighty fleets were destroyed, and half of our colonies lay in ruins. But none of it had ever reached our homeworld, Dominus Prime. The battles were always fought on distant lands, far from our eyes, beyond the edges of the galaxy. We watched trade decline. Condolence messages became commonplace, delivered to families who had lost soldiers on the front lines. But that was always the nature of war. And we had always been warriors. The spaceports emptied until 9 out of 10 orbital docks stood abandoned. Grieving families multiplied, and soon everyone knew someone who had been killed, captured, or simply vanished into the void. Even then, we never considered defeat a real possibility. In the darkest times, we burned brightest. If the enemy struck us down, we would rise. If they hit us hard, we would strike back twice as fiercely. In the end, the only difference would be that victory would taste even sweeter. Dominions never retreat. Never surrender. Then came the announcement. Our government had decided to surrender. The shock paralyzed us. It couldn't be true. The first reaction was disbelief. Someone must have made a mistake. Perhaps the humans had sabotaged our communication systems. But the next day, new confirmations arrived, until no doubt remained. The war wasn't far away anymore. It had consumed us entirely. They were serious. Our government had made its decision. We had lost the war, and there was no choice but to surrender to the humans. The hours that followed felt unreal, like a nightmare we couldn't wake from. Life came to a halt. No one went to work. Schools were empty. Crowds wandered aimlessly through the streets like lost souls, unable to comprehend the impossible. How could this have happened? We had never surrendered. Not in 1,000 years. Not in hundreds of wars. Our fleet was the most powerful in the galaxy. And in the beginning, all signs pointed to our victory. Our initial strike obliterated an entire human fleet. Within days, their nearest colonies were within our reach, before they could even regroup. We held every advantage. And yet, the humans were our natural enemies. During our war against the Revenue, they supplied weapons and provisions to our foes. Their colonies expanded relentlessly, encroaching upon our sphere of influence. They were an insatiable, predatory species, one that took everything and armed its allies to massacre those who dared to resist. This couldn't have happened. It couldn't be real. And yet, it was. As that truth began to take root, fear spread like wildfire. The government announced the arrival of the human occupation forces. We all knew what that meant. We had heard the stories. What had happened to our outer colonies when they fell to them? Mass executions. Relentless hunts for anyone who posed a threat. Forced labor, daily torture, and the worst of all, the thing never officially acknowledged, but whispered in grim, shadowed rumors. Before the first human even set foot on Drakkari's prime, many had already chosen suicide. Better to die with honor than be dragged to a slave camp. The government tried to suppress the despair, ordering us to endure the inevitable for the sake of future generations. Most complied. But some questioned why we should obey a government that had condemned us to ruin. The first sign of our downfall was the immediate arrest of anyone who protested. A grim marker of the fate awaiting us. The feeling that something irreversible was unfolding swept across the entire planet. Some soldiers and civilians tried to resist. They demanded that we continue the war, no matter the cost. But the government, anticipating rebellion, had already stationed loyal troops at key points. The uprisings were crushed before they could gain momentum. And as the resistance withered, the rest of us simply waited. Sitting. Watching. Dreading. When would the humans arrive? Perhaps a month passed after the official announcement. Then came the day the world ended. Without warning, the government declared that the human fleet would enter orbit the next morning. But there was no panic, only resignation. If this was to be our end, we would face it with dignity, as Draconians always had. Many said their farewells to loved ones, retreating into their homes, reflecting on their lives before the death squads began to disembark. Some of us watched, through telescopes, the arrival of the occupying force. Their battalions were not enormous, but to the elders, they were overwhelming. I counted more than twice the number of ships we had in our largest fleet at the start of the war. And that was only what the humans had after 4 years of combat. They had other fleets scattered across the stars, patrolling conquered worlds and wiping out the last remnants of resistance. At least now we knew how we had been defeated. But it no longer mattered. Then came the official surrender. In the empty hangar of the human cruiser, our leaders marched in, broadcast live to us all. We knew what to expect: humiliation. We would have to admit our inferiority, acknowledge the righteousness of the enemy's cause, and bow before our conquerors. Because that was how wars ended. It had always been so. Depending on how vengeful the victors felt, our leaders might have been executed right there. But instead, they were handed a piece of paperboard, a simple sheet, and ordered to sign their names. The broadcast was briefly interrupted by an official announcer, explaining that this was not merely a symbolic gesture. The cardboard bore the terms of surrender, and by signing it, our leaders, and by extension, the entire Draconian Empire, recognized its legitimacy. A strange custom. But that was how the aliens did things. Afterwards came the expected declaration of submission, the recognition of the justice of the victors. Yet it was brief, almost indifferent, as though the humans viewed that act as a minor formality, overshadowed by the true milestone, the signing of the surrender. And then, that was it. No executions. No torture. Only silence. Some of us began to hope. Others merely held their breath. Within hours, the first ships began to land. The occupying forces spread out to take control of the cities. I hesitated. Should I hide? Watch? I decided it was best to stay away from the window, as if that could somehow protect me from random acts of violence. But in the end, I couldn't resist. First came the tanks, gliding over suspension fields, hovering just inches above the ground. Our technology was similar, yet those monstrosities looked at least twice as heavy as anything we had ever built. Then came the troop transports, also carried by suspension fields. And then, at the center of the column, the infantry. Row after row of fortified warriors, fully encapsulated in armor that made them look like walking tanks. Our exoskeletons were strong enough to bear heavy weaponry. Theirs. That was another matter entirely. I remember every detail, the insignias on their arms, the weight of the oppressive silence, the frightened eyes of neighbors peeking from their windows. That was when I realized a bitter truth. We had no idea what kind of enemy we were up against. Had we known, perhaps we would have thought twice before starting this war. Although, deep down, maybe it wouldn't have changed a thing. We had always believed we were the strongest. Never hesitated to challenge anyone. But at that moment, in the face of our ruin, I understood that we had brought this fate upon ourselves. We weren't betrayed. We weren't undone by some trick. We had simply underestimated the enemy. We had been arrogant. Profoundly, uncomfortably, and dangerously arrogant. We had placed blind trust in our own strength and utterly ignored our enemy. A disastrous combination that had inevitably led us to this fate. Almost like some ancient parable. If I was about to die, then at the very least, I could do so with the certainty that there was some logic to the universe. Lost in my own thoughts, I watched the armies march past. Their movements were so synchronized, so flawless, that they mesmerized me. Apparently, I wasn't the only one. One of my neighbors was so entranced by the scene that he didn't notice his young daughter, far too small, restless, and unpredictable, walk out from the building's atrium, straight into the path of the soldiers' column. My memory of that moment is crystal clear. I saw her white clothes fluttering in the wind as she advanced, innocent, unaware of the danger. I braced myself to see her crushed beneath the weight of the armored march. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the soldiers broke formation and gently scooped the child up in his arms. It was impossible to believe that something so immense and relentless could also be so delicate. And yet, she didn't even cry. The soldier carried her back to the entrance of the building and carefully set her down on one of the benches. Then he took something from his pouch and handed it to her. From my angle, I couldn't see what it was. But moments later, he turned and rejoined the formation, his heavy armor echoing down the street, while the girl, now seated, watched him walk away, curious, but not afraid. A few seconds later, she began to eat. Food. The human had given her food. Moments after that, someone from the building came out and brought her back inside, and the alien column continued its march, utterly indifferent to our presence. That was the moment I felt something shift. Perhaps this wasn't the end we had feared after all. Until then, I had debated with myself whether it would be better to be executed in the first wave or survive long enough to witness the coming oppression. The absence of executions at the surrender ceremony had already suggested that genocide was not part of the plan, but occupation still promised to be brutal. And yet, the way that soldier treated a mere child. We never truly understood the aliens. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was worth living long enough to find out what it really meant to be under their rule. Maybe, after seeing how easily we had been defeated, it was time to question what our government had told us all along. Perhaps, the reports about the occupied colonies weren't as reliable as we had believed. As the sun rose over our surrendered world, a single thought spun endlessly in my mind. Perhaps we were wrong about the humans. The occupation forces took over all government buildings and established checkpoints along the main routes. I still had a job, as far as I knew, and as a low-level government employee, I was expected to report to the occupiers. The day after the surrender, I passed through the checkpoints, unsure whether I'd be arrested or executed. But instead, my supervisor simply told me to carry on with my duties as if nothing had happened. An interview with a human officer would be scheduled at some point during the day. What followed were 5 tense hours, waiting for the inevitable. After midday, we were ordered to gather in a room on the 4th floor. On the way, I passed several human soldiers. Their armor was less bulky than that of the frontline infantry, but still, they looked formidable. My hearts were racing, analyzing each one, trying to determine whether any of them were part of an execution squad. In the meeting room, I sat beside about 20 of my colleagues and waited. After a few minutes, a human entered. He introduced himself as Doug. It took me a moment to realize that this was his name, not a title. Either way, it was unpronounceable. Doug explained that he would now be overseeing all administrative departments of the local government. Then he launched into a long presentation on standardized protocols, charts, diagrams, regulations. He said that any documents with political implications were to be submitted in triplicate, one for our own records, one for local censors, and one for the planetary government. But in the end, he didn't seem to expect the government, or any local authority, to hold any real relevance. The government itself no longer expected the planetary leaders to matter. It no longer believed any authority remained. And the much-feared reign of terror never materialized. It was surreal how normal everything felt. The day of the surrender was supposed to be the end. But everything simply carried on. In time, I got to know Doug better. I managed to pronounce his name properly after a few months. He was a capable man, sometimes unpredictable, but with a generosity I had never seen in a commander on Drakari's prime. And as the months passed, I realized that most of the humans in the occupation government were just like him. After a while, I might even say I became friends with a few of them. It was then that I came to understand a truth I had, on some level, already known for quite some time. The surrender had not been the end. It was hard to admit. Millions of lives lost. Cities reduced to ash. Years of suffering. To accept that it had all been for nothing, a purposeless imperial war, was not an easy thing. But I saw the evidence every single day. It was impossible to deny. The day the humans arrived wasn't the end of the world. Well, perhaps it was. The end of the old Draconians. But a new people was rising. And perhaps, by working with the humans, we could build something better.